today I'll just come out, chill out a little bit. I'm on the back side of the range. Well, not behind the impact area, but way on the other end of the range, I'll put it that way. I come out here and it's quick and close. Makes it easy for me to come up and find a place to come out and shoot my videos and be quiet for a little bit, you know. The first thing we got to do is simply tie off the haversack. You know, I hadn't put my little string on this one yet. I should have, but I didn't. So it's just got to hang there. And I'm going to be taking my itty bitty new one I'm looking at. I know this ain't a review yet. I'm doing field testing for this right now. So it's a lot smaller and lighter. It does good as a scout or a, you know, ultralight type deal. But it's definitely a lot smaller and lighter than the one I normally camp with. But for the moment, it will do. What I want to talk about today is failures. Or rather, I should say, as my old Marine buddy would say, lessons learned. That was something, that phrase was used a lot in Vietnam. Apparently there was a book that when you were an outgoing unit or whatever, you were supposed to contribute to it if you could, about tips and tricks, things you'd learned in country that could help you, the incoming soldiers. So a lot of times my old mentor, Francis McGowan, would say it was lessons learned. It meant something I learned the hard way. And that was, you know, really helpful to me in my early days. Sometimes it was lessons that I learned easily. Sometimes not so much. Making sure this isn't twisted. Everything's flat. I think this will do just fine for sitting and talking. Just like that. Yeah, I know it's too high. That's how I roll. Yeah. Let me adjust the camera and we'll talk. Got my whittling stick. Mr. William Collins. There we go. Make sure I'm not crushing my glasses or something. Pull out my knife, and yes, I'm running my old Master Woodsman prototype today just for nostalgia's sake. Alright. Lessons learned. What that means is it's things that over the years I learned a lesson and I wanted to pass them on to you or to someone else. Now, it doesn't have to be a huge big thing. It can be relatively easy. But a lot of times those lessons learned came at a cost. And God knows I paid some. Now in a recent video, I was talking about accidental contamination with a knife and cooking and getting chicken blood into other foods and it causing people to get sick. Let me tell you one of my little stories of that. For many years I was in living history, as I've said, and we were at the Southeastern Rendezvous And I want to say that this is the one that was in Savannah years ago. I want to say that was one. There were a lot of them. Well, we were dog soldiers, so they kind of blur together now, 20 years later. And back in them days, I ran 2 coolers a lot, because these living history events were week-long events, and we were going to be out there, say, from Thursday until the next, Saturday week. So you'd be out there 10, 12, 14 days sometimes at these events. We were the dog soldiers. And what are dog soldiers? That meant if it wasn't God's job, it was our job. The toilet needs paper, we get it. Need firewood over here, we get it. Somebody's truck got stuck, we get it. And these events would have 8,000, 10,000 or more people at it. So it was our job to be kind of like the staff at it. And we would do daily patrols where we'd walk around, ask people what was going on, and see if people needed things or whatever. As well as somebody needed something, they'd come find us. And I ran 2 different coolers back in them days. The 2 coolers, here was my mistake, lesson learned, were the same exact cooler looking at them. They were both red with a white top, igloos. And there'd be a canvas cover that we put over it to keep the historic atmosphere. And I had made them out of identically the same canvas. So the 2 coolers sitting there, I couldn't tell apart until I opened it up and looked in it. One cooler had all the meat in it, raw meat, frozen, etc. The other cooler had all the drinks and things like that in it. And to keep from cross-contamination, I had the 2 coolers. Well, we were coming back from a particularly hot patrol that day. And only thing I wanted in this whole universe was a cup of ice water. That just sounded so wonderful to me at that time. And as me and Jeff Cross were walking up to the tent, literally, I'm 20 feet from my tent, someone hollered "dog soldier," and a report came to us that a lady back over that way had dropped a butcher knife and it had cut her leg pretty badly. Well, Jeff was an EMT, and so he was on the, so to speak, the medical staff for us. And he said he wanted me to go with him. So I quickly stepped inside my tent, snatched up one of the lids, plunged the cup down in the ice water, came up, slammed the lid down. It was so dark in the tent I couldn't hardly see. And I went to chugging water as I came out, and I slapped the cup down on the deck, and we went to the emergency where the lady had been cut. Luckily, it only required a couple of stitches, and she wasn't going to be, permanently hurt. But we got back to camp probably 2 hours later. It never occurred to me to go check. Now, that night it got down to, as memory serves, our little weather guru we had that was part of the group, he said it got down to 18 that night. I just remember it got bitter cold. About 1 in the morning, I'm laying in my bed with 2 pair of long johns on and my great big old Arctic sleeping bag. My wife is on her side, on the other side of the tent with her complete gear. And I woke up and just felt kind of bad. I hadn't felt bad when I lay down, but right then I felt kind of bad. And as I lay there, I got to feeling worse and worse and worse and worse. Until I finally realized how bloated my stomach was, and I'm about to throw up. It's 18 degrees and you're in a canvas tent in the middle of the woods. Well, there are people around me, but what I mean, there ain't no bathroom right here. And when it hit, I rolled out of the rack onto the floor and managed to grab a bucket. And I got sick, violently sick, and sweat boiled out of me. So I immediately snatched off my long handles to keep them from getting soaking wet, because it is 18 degrees and heat just radiated off of you. And we shall spare gory details to say both ends of the tunnel were running. So I would get violently sick. Then I would have to put my clothes back on because I'm shivering so violently and climb back into that sleeping bag, knowing that in 10-15 minutes I'm going to do it again. And that went on from 1 or 2 in the morning till about 7:30 that morning. Violently ill, violently sick from probably salmonella poisoning because of that chicken blood. Now the next morning, the medical group that was part of our group got to me, and they got electrolytes in me and stuff and stabilized me and etc. And we were determined that I'd basically run the course. There's no sense going to the ER now. They were going to be watching me. If I deteriorated, we'd go to the ER. But remembering how violently sick I was out here in the cold, that was a lesson learned. When we got home, first thing, I got a different cooler. It was a different color. It was a different shape. I made a different cover to go on it, so when you came in that tent, there was no doubt which cooler you had. So my lesson learned was raw meat goes into this cooler, everything else goes into that cooler. These two coolers are not mixed up. Today, on top of my ice chest that's for that, it is written in big letters, meat. So I know. And it's completely different shape and color from my drink cooler that I utilize. So even in the dark, I cannot grab the wrong one. That was a very painful lesson learned right there. Another lesson learned that I found out, following along the lines of what we recently talked about, was about my tarps. And whenever I would carry a tarp set or something like that, or just a new piece of gear, never take a piece of gear that you have to count on out in the woods without trying it out first at home. Now I had spent a pretty good bit of money on a sil nylon tarp because we were going, I believe it was up to the mountains of Tennessee to do some hiking many years ago. And I had been told by the guy at the backpacking shop there in Birmingham that this was the end-all be-all, and that all the backpackers on the Appalachian Trail were now using this, and it was awesome, and it was blah blah blah, and it was so small and so light and so tough, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker. And whenever he pulled it out, I couldn't believe that was a full-size tarp. We unfolded it in the thing, and it was an honest to God 12-foot, 10 by 12-foot tarp. Wow. You know, wadded up, something like that. Wow. And it cost near about a week's wages back then. But, you know, hey, you want the good stuff, you got to pay for it, right? So I bought it. And 2 weeks after that, we were going to be going on this trip. And so, other than making sure that the little bag of tent stakes was with it, and other than making sure it had guy lines with it, that was all I did. I'd opened it up in the store, and then I had got it back in the bag, and that went on top of my pack. We got dropped off, me and 2 friends, and we were going to hike, and it was about 26 miles from A to B through the mountains that we were going for. And we were up on top of that mountain with a thunderstorm rolling in on us several hours later, and we decided we were going to have to make camp early, a lot earlier than we had planned. Well, you know, dun-ta-da-da, I brought out my new tarp. I set it up. Life was going to be beautiful. My 2 running mates were jealous because they still had their plain old 8-footers. And here I had this huge Taj Mahal. I was going to be the king of the mountain. And then the rain hit. and that gossamer thin little bitty tarp held up for maybe 20 minutes. And then a grommet on the side that the wind was coming from began to elongate as it stretched out around the brass type nylon like grommet it had. And I could see that. So I tried reaching from underneath outside and tying it and hooking it back to stay to keep from tearing out. I ended up tying all 4 points, getting wet doing it. Where it went over my ridge line with it sawing back and forth in this heavy rain and high wind, it started to tear up here at the end. Within an hour of that storm starting, it had completely just shredded and fell apart. It had acted like it was made out of cardboard. I mean, that's the closest thing I can give you to it. It's strong until it gets wet, and it fell apart. Any sil nylon coating, yeah, the material may have had it, but all the seams, all the grommets, everything else were in tissue paper. And they began to stretch, and once the tear started, it just ran. So I ended up with my poncho over me, sitting up against a tree on top of my backpack, and that's how I spent the rest of the evening, because that storm lasted 5 or 6, 7 hours at least. It was early in the morning when it finally let up. Now, why didn't I go getting the other one? There goes. Their little tarps was big enough for them and their gear, and that was about it. And I was already wet. And as I sat there with sitting on top of my backpack with my, legs crossed, Indian style, my poncho tucked under me, me leaning back against a tree, I was drier than I would have been underneath that tarp. I was soaked. I eventually, during the night, body heat dried it out. The next morning was a pretty miserable morning and a pretty miserable hike. And luckily, that was the only rain we had. But for the rest of that long hike, I had only a poncho. That was my sole covering. And so that was lesson learned to me. Never, ever take a brand new piece of gear and rely on it without testing it first. Any piece of gear can fail. Anything will fail if it's forced or something unexpected happens. On the walk here just a few minutes ago, place back down there where I have hung a hammock several times, harpooned in the ground is about a 3/4 inch stake coming up about 8 or 9 inches, and it snapped off with this 4 or 5 foot long limb. It fell in one of our recent rainstorms and harpooned that hard. It's probably 3 inches in the ground right now. Now, if I'd been up under it with a thin sil nylon tarp and a thin little hammock, I'm not saying it would have gone through me, but it would have done damage to me. That tarp would have done nothing to slow that down. And that's one of the things you got to be aware of. Another lesson learned is I had a rainstorm and a tarp, and so many little bitty limbs fell and kept poking holes into it that I made a point of never getting up underneath a tree with a bunch of dead limbs on it. Like where I'm at right now, and I'll pan around here in a minute to show you what I'm talking about. This is what I'm talking about. Okay, right there in front of you. See all those dead limbs of that oak? Coming out, jutting out, all these dead limbs. You see that green canopy up here, but look a little lower. These are the dead shed limbs of this tree. Now right now, in pretty weather, there being my hammock, there's no problem. But what if we had a real whipping storm coming through and a lot of wind? What do you think all those little limbs would do? They're so brittle they just snap. They just snap. But that thing's like sharp points. It'd break and come flying at you like shrapnel. So, in conclusion, lessons learned are quite often learned a very hard way. I want you to think about things that you've learned. And when you're passing on information to someone else, don't forget to pass on your failures. The what, the where, the why. Your successes are great, but failure, first attempt in learning, is how we really learn. And when you're teaching someone else, be sure to point out your failures too. Till next time, I'm Blackie, wishing you safe journeys. Have a great day, guys.